She found the photograph at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, hidden inside a hollowed-out Bible on the third shelf of her husband's private study. In the photograph, a young woman smiled at the camera, her dark hair caught by the wind, her eyes alive with a joy that would never grow old. On the back, someone had written a single line in faded ink, "Forgive me." But here's what made her blood run cold. The woman in the photograph had been missing for 12 years. Her husband had been the last person to see her alive. And the signature at the bottom of that desperate plea matched his handwriting perfectly. She had married into one of the most powerful families in Sicily. She had danced at a wedding that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime. She had believed she was starting a fairy tale. But standing there in the dark, holding evidence that could destroy everything, she realized the truth. She hadn't married a prince. She had married a man who might be hiding a secret so terrible that uncovering it could cost her life. Before I tell you how this all began, and how it ended in a way that changed everything she thought she knew, I need you to do something for me. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, and leave me a comment answering this question. If you discovered your husband was connected to a missing persons case, would you expose him or protect the family? Your answer might change by the time this story ends. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to the day when Elena Castellano believed she was the luckiest woman in the world. Saturday, June 15, 4:23 in the afternoon, the Moretti estate outside Palermo. The sun hung low over the Mediterranean, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose as 300 guests gathered on the sprawling grounds of a villa that had belonged to the Moretti family for over a century. Elena stood at the entrance of the outdoor cathedral they had constructed just for this occasion, her white gown trailing behind her like a river of silk, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was 27 years old, a translator who had grown up in a modest apartment in Naples, and in exactly 12 minutes, she would become the wife of Marco Moretti, the only son of Antonio Moretti, a man whose name was spoken in whispers throughout southern Italy. She had met Marco 8 months earlier at a gallery opening in Rome. He had been standing alone in front of a painting of the Sicilian coastline, his dark eyes reflecting something that looked almost like homesickness. She had commented on the brushwork. He had smiled and asked her name. And from that moment forward, her life had accelerated in ways she could never have predicted. The courtship had been intense, overwhelming, consuming. Marco was attentive, passionate, and surprisingly vulnerable when they were alone together. He had told her that he felt different from his family, that he had always struggled with the weight of his father's expectations, that meeting her had made him feel like he could finally breathe. She had believed every word. The music began, a string quartet playing something classical and elegant, and Elena began her walk down the aisle. She passed politicians whose faces she recognized from television. She passed businessmen whose names appeared in headlines. She passed women dripping in diamonds, men with cold eyes and warm smiles, and she told herself that this was normal. This was simply what it meant to marry into wealth. She did not let herself think about the whispered rumors. She did not let herself wonder why her new family's fortune seemed to have no clear origin. She simply walked toward Marco, who was waiting for her at the altar with tears in his eyes, and she let herself believe that love was enough. The ceremony was perfect. The reception was even more spectacular. There was a 20-piece orchestra, rare wines that had been aging since before Elena was born, and a 7-tier cake that took 4 people to carry. Antonio Moretti himself gave a toast, his voice deep and resonant, his presence commanding the attention of every person in attendance. He spoke of legacy, of family, of the importance of loyalty above all else. And when he raised his glass to welcome Elena into the family, his eyes found hers across the crowd, and something in his gaze made her feel like she was being evaluated rather than celebrated. But she pushed that thought aside. She danced with Marco as the stars emerged overhead. She laughed as his cousins made inappropriate jokes. She posed for photographs that would later appear in society pages across Italy. And when the night finally ended and Marco carried her over the threshold of the private wing they would share in the family estate, she convinced herself that whatever shadows existed in this family, they would not touch her. She was wrong. The shadows had been waiting for her all along. The first week of marriage was a honeymoon within the estate walls. Marco explained that it was safer this way, that there were people who would target them if they traveled openly, that privacy was a gift they could give each other. Elena accepted this explanation. She spent her days exploring the grounds, swimming in the infinity pool that overlooked the coast, reading in the library that contained more books than some public institutions. She spent her evenings with Marco, learning the rhythms of his moods, the way he seemed most at peace just after sunset, the way he sometimes stared at nothing with an expression she could not read. But by the second week, she began to notice the bars. They were not literal bars, of course. The Morettas were far too sophisticated for that. But they were bars nonetheless. She noticed that she could not leave the grounds without an escort. She noticed that her phone calls sometimes had strange echoes, as if someone else was listening. She noticed that the household staff watched her with a careful attention that went beyond simple service. And she noticed that certain doors were always locked. Sunday, June 30th, 9:14 in the morning, the east wing of the Moretti estate. Elena was looking for a vase to hold the flowers she had picked from the garden when she tried the handle of a door she had never noticed before. It was tucked into an alcove near the back staircase, painted the same cream color as the walls, almost invisible unless you were paying attention. The handle did not move. She tried again, thinking perhaps it was stuck, but no. It was locked, and locked deliberately. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find one of the household staff, a middle-aged woman named Carla whose smile never reached her eyes. "That room is used for storage," Carla said smoothly. "Old records, furniture, things the family no longer needs." "Is there something I can help you find, Signora?" Elena smiled and said she was just exploring, and Carla nodded and walked away. But as Elena returned to her search for a vase, she could not shake the feeling that she had just failed some kind of test. That night at dinner, Marco seemed distracted. He answered her questions with half attention, his eyes drifting toward his phone, which he had placed face down on the table beside his plate. Twice it buzzed, and twice he ignored it, but the third time, he excused himself and stepped onto the terrace, closing the glass doors behind him. Elena watched his silhouette as he spoke into the phone, his gestures sharp, his posture tense. The conversation lasted 7 minutes. When he returned, his smile was back in place, but his eyes were not smiling. "Business," he said simply. "Nothing for you to worry about." Elena nodded and returned to her dinner. But she was beginning to understand that in this family, business was a word that covered a multitude of sins. Thursday, July 4th, 2:37 in the afternoon. Elena was walking through the west garden when she heard voices coming from the small stone building that the family used as a guest house. The voices were low and urgent, and one of them belonged to Marco. She moved closer, staying behind the tall hedge that bordered the path, and she caught fragments of the conversation. "It cannot surface now," someone was saying, someone older, someone whose voice she did not recognize. After all these years, to have it surface now would be catastrophic. Marco's response was too quiet to hear, but the other voice continued. "The Castellano girl. Your wife. Are you certain she suspects nothing?" Elena's heart stopped. They were talking about her. They were asking whether she suspected something. Which meant there was something to suspect. She heard footsteps approaching the door and forced herself to move, walking quickly back toward the main house, her pulse pounding in her ears. She did not turn around to see if they had noticed her. She simply walked, and smiled at the gardener who nodded in her direction, and pretended that her entire world had not just shifted on its axis. That night, she lay beside Marco in their bed, listening to his breathing slow as he drifted into sleep, and she made a decision. She was going to find out what they were hiding. And she was going to do it without getting caught. The investigation began slowly, carefully, a series of small actions that could be explained away if necessary. She started asking questions about the family history, framing her curiosity as a new wife's natural interest in her husband's heritage. She learned that the Moretti fortune had been built over 3 generations, starting with Marco's great-grandfather, who had emigrated from a small village in the mountains and somehow arrived in Palermo with enough money to buy property. No one explained where that initial money had come from. She learned that Antonio Moretti had inherited the family business at the age of 32, after his own father had died under circumstances that were described as sudden. No one elaborated on what sudden meant. She learned that Marco had an older sister who had died in childhood, a tragedy that was never discussed, and that his mother had passed away when he was 16, retreating from the world in her final years until she was more ghost than woman. But it was the story of Lucia Ferrante that finally gave Elena a thread to pull. She found the name in a newspaper clipping that had been tucked inside a book of poetry in the library, a book so dusty that it clearly had not been touched in years. The clipping was dated 12 years earlier and described the disappearance of a young woman named Lucia Ferrante, age 23, last seen in the company of an unnamed man at a cafe in Palermo. The police had investigated but found nothing. The case had gone cold. Lucia Ferrante had simply vanished, as if she had never existed at all. There was no photograph in the clipping. There was no mention of the Moretti family. But there was a single line that made Elena's hands tremble. The unnamed man had been described by witnesses as young, dark-haired, and driving a silver vehicle with distinctive Palermo plates. Marco had been 22 at the time of Lucia's disappearance. And Elena had seen photographs in the family albums of a young Marco standing proudly beside a silver sports car that had belonged to his father. Saturday, July 13, 11:47 in the evening. Elena waited until Marco fell asleep, then slipped out of bed and made her way down the dark hallway toward his study. She had memorized the location of every creaking floorboard, every security camera, every potential obstacle. She had timed the rounds of the night guards and knew she had approximately 8 minutes before anyone would pass by this section of the house. The study door was locked, but Marco kept a spare key in the drawer of the hall table, hidden beneath a stack of stationery. She had discovered this 3 days earlier when she had pretended to search for a pen while he watched television in the adjacent room. She found the key, unlocked the door, and stepped inside, her heart hammering so loudly that she was certain someone would hear it. The study was dark, but she did not dare turn on the lights. Instead, she used her phone as a flashlight, keeping the beam low and narrow as she searched. The desk revealed nothing unusual. The filing cabinet was locked with a combination she did not know. But the bookshelf along the far wall caught her attention, specifically, a Bible that seemed out of place among the business texts and legal volumes. She pulled it from the shelf and felt its weight shift oddly. When she opened it, she found that the pages had been cut away to create a hidden compartment. And inside that compartment was the photograph. Lucia Ferrante smiled up at her from the glossy paper, young and beautiful and forever frozen in time. On the back was that single desperate line. "Forgive me." And the signature beneath it was unmistakably Marco's handwriting. Elena heard footsteps in the hallway and shoved the photograph back into the Bible, her hands shaking so badly that she nearly dropped it. She replaced the book on the shelf, locked the door behind her, returned the key to its hiding place, and made it back to her bedroom with 30 seconds to spare before the guard's silhouette passed by the window at the end of the hall. She lay in bed beside her sleeping husband, staring at the ceiling, and tried to make sense of what she had found. Marco had known Lucia Ferrante. Marco had been with her before she disappeared. Marco had hidden a photograph and begged for forgiveness in writing. The obvious conclusion was monstrous. But Elena was beginning to realize that in this family, the obvious conclusion might only be the beginning. The days that followed were a careful performance. Elena smiled at breakfast. She made small talk with Marco's aunt, a severe woman named Rosaria who lived in the North Wing and watched everyone with the calculating gaze of a predator. She attended the social events that were required of her as the Don's daughter-in-law, wearing designer dresses and diamond earrings and pretending that she belonged. But beneath the surface, she was unraveling. She began to study Marco's behavior with new eyes, cataloging his moods, his habits, his tells. She noticed that he grew tense whenever anyone mentioned the past. She noticed that he sometimes woke in the night, gasping as if from a nightmare, and refused to tell her what he had dreamed. She noticed that his father watched him with an expression that was not quite pride, not quite disappointment, but something closer to caution. And she noticed that whenever she asked innocent questions about his life before they met, his answers were carefully rehearsed, as if he had practiced them in front of a mirror. She needed more information. She needed to find someone who could tell her about Lucia Ferrante. And she needed to do it without alerting anyone in the family. Wednesday, July 24th, 3:15 in the afternoon, a cafe in the old quarter of Palermo. Elena had told Marco she was meeting a friend from her university days, a harmless lunch date that would give her a few hours of freedom. What she did not tell him was that she had spent the past week tracking down an address, a former colleague of Lucia's who had been quoted in one of the few newspaper articles that covered the disappearance. The woman's name was Giovanna Basile, and she agreed to meet Elena with a wariness that suggested she knew exactly why someone would be asking about Lucia after all these years. Giovanna was in her late 30s, with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. She listened as Elena introduced herself, and when Elena mentioned that she had recently married into the Moretti family, Giovanna's face went pale. "You should not be here," Giovanna said quietly. "You should not be asking these questions." Elena leaned forward. "I found a photograph. Lucia Ferrante. Hidden in my husband's study. He wrote something on the back. Forgive me. I need to know what happened to her." Giovanna was silent for a long moment, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup as if drawing warmth from it. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Lucia was in love with someone. Someone from a powerful family. She told me they were going to run away together, start a new life somewhere no one could find them. But then she disappeared, and the man she loved pretended she had never existed. Elena's throat tightened. Marco. She was in love with Marco. Giovanna nodded slowly. She never told me his name. But I saw them together once, from a distance. A young man with dark hair and dark eyes, driving a silver car. He looked at her like she was the sun and he was afraid of burning. What do you think happened to her? Giovanna's eyes filled with something that might have been grief, or might have been fear. I think she trusted the wrong person. I think she believed in a fairy tale. And I think fairy tales, in this world, end with blood and silence. Elena left the cafe with more questions than answers, but one thing was becoming terrifyingly clear. Her husband had loved a woman who had vanished without a trace, and he had been hiding that secret for over a decade. The question was whether he was hiding it out of guilt, out of grief, or out of something far more sinister. Thursday, August 1st, 7:42 in the evening, the Moretti estate. Elena was walking through the garden when she encountered Antonio Moretti, the Don himself, standing alone beside the fountain that marked the center of the grounds. He turned as she approached, and his smile was warm, but his eyes were calculating. "Elena," he said, gesturing for her to join him. "I have been hoping for a moment to speak with you." She stopped beside him, keeping her expression neutral, her posture relaxed. "Of course, father." She had been told to call him father. It still felt wrong on her tongue. "You have been curious lately," Antonio continued, his voice as smooth as aged whiskey. "Asking questions about the family. Spending time in the library. Walking through parts of the house that most guests never see." Elena felt ice form in her stomach. "I am trying to learn about my new home," she said carefully. "To understand my husband's heritage." Antonio nodded slowly. "Understanding is important. But knowledge, Elena, is a dangerous thing. There are truths that exist to be shared, and there are truths that exist to be protected. A wise woman knows the difference." He reached out and took her hand, his grip gentle but firm. "You are family now. You carry the Moretti name. Whatever questions you have, whatever concerns, you should bring them to me. Or to Marco. We will tell you what you need to know." He released her hand and walked away, his footsteps silent on the gravel path. Elena watched him go, and she understood the message beneath his words. He knew she was investigating. He was warning her to stop. But the warning only confirmed what she had suspected. There was something in this family's past that was worth protecting at any cost. And she was getting closer to finding it. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Rosaria, the aunt who watched everyone with suspicious eyes, approached Elena one morning in the breakfast room and asked if she would like to see the family's private chapel. Elena agreed, uncertain why the offer was being made, and followed Rosaria through the estate to a small stone building that she had never noticed before. The chapel was simple, almost austere, with wooden pews and a single stained glass window that filtered the light into colors of blood and gold. Rosaria stood before the altar, her back to Elena, and spoke in a voice that was softer than anything Elena had heard from her before. "You want to know about Lucia?" It was not a question. Elena's breath caught. "How did you know?" Rosaria turned, and for the first time, Elena saw something human behind her cold facade. "Because I was the one who introduced them. Lucia was my goddaughter. I thought Marco could save her from the poverty she had grown up in. I thought he would love her the way she deserved." Her voice broke slightly. "I was wrong." Elena stepped closer. "What happened to her?" Rosaria's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "My brother happened to her. Antonio. He discovered the affair and decided that it was unacceptable. Amoretti could not marry a girl with no money, no connections, no value to the family's alliances. He gave Marco an ultimatum: end the relationship or be cut off from everything. And Marco chose the family," Elena said quietly. "No." Rosaria shook her head. "Marco chose Lucia. He told his father that he would leave, that he would give up everything for her. They planned to run away together, to start over somewhere far from Sicily. But before they could leave, Lucia disappeared. And Marco has never been the same." Elena's mind raced. "Are you saying that Antonio did something to her?" Rosaria was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "I am saying that my brother is a man who protects the family above all else. I am saying that problems in this family have a way of vanishing. And I am saying that if you are smart, Elena, you will stop asking questions before you become a problem too." She walked past Elena and out of the chapel, leaving her alone with the ghosts. Elena was running out of time, and she knew it. The warnings had been clear. The dawn was watching her. The family was closing ranks. And somewhere in the shadows, Marco was carrying a secret that was eating him alive. She needed to confront him. She needed to know the truth, not the fragments and whispers she had been piecing together, but the full, unvarnished reality of what had happened to Lucia Ferrante. She chose her moment carefully. Friday, August 9th, 11:23 at night, their private quarters. Marco was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at his hands, lost in whatever thoughts haunted him when he thought no one was watching. Elena locked the door behind her and stood before him, her heart pounding. "I know about Lucia," she said. Marco's head snapped up, his face draining of color. "What?" "Lucia Ferrante. The woman you were going to run away with 12 years ago. The woman who disappeared. I found the photograph, Marco. I found your handwriting. Forgive me. I need to know what happened to her." For a long moment, Marco simply stared at her, his expression cycling through shock, fear, and something that looked almost like relief. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw. "I did not hurt her. I swear to you, Elena, I never touched her. I loved her. I loved her more than I have ever loved anyone, and I was going to give up everything to be with her. Then what happened?" Marco's eyes filled with tears. "My father found out about our plan. He was furious. He told me that I was betraying the family, that I was throwing away my legacy for a girl who was beneath me. I refused to listen. I told Lucia to meet me at the train station at midnight, that we would leave together and never look back." He paused, his voice breaking. "She never arrived. I waited for 4 hours, but she never came. And when I went to her apartment the next morning, it was empty. Her clothes were gone. Her belongings were gone. She had vanished." Elena's chest ached. "Did you look for her?" "For years. I hired investigators. I searched every town, every city, every place we had ever talked about visiting. Nothing. It was as if she had been erased from existence. He looked at Elena with desperate eyes. I wrote those words on the photograph because I blamed myself. Because I thought that if I had been stronger, if I had left with her sooner, she might still be alive. But I did not kill her, Elena. I swear on my mother's grave, I did not kill her. Elena wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust the anguish in his voice, the tears on his face, the years of grief that had clearly carved themselves into his soul. But there was one question she still needed to ask. Do you think your father did it? Marco was silent. And in that silence, Elena found her answer. The days that followed were the most dangerous of Elena's life. She continued her investigation, now with Marco as a reluctant ally, searching for any evidence that could prove Antonio's involvement in Lucia's disappearance. They worked in secret, communicating through coded messages, meeting in hidden corners of the estate where they believed they would not be overheard. They discovered that Antonio had made several large cash withdrawals in the days following Lucia's disappearance. They discovered that a bodyguard who had been assigned to Marco at the time had abruptly retired and moved to another country. They discovered that the police officer who had originally investigated the case had received an unexplained payment 6 months later and had closed the case without further action. The evidence was circumstantial, but it painted a damning picture. Antonio Moretti had seen his son's love as a threat to the family and had eliminated that threat with ruthless efficiency. But proving it was another matter entirely. And as Elena and Marco dug deeper, they began to realize that they were not the only ones with an agenda. Wednesday, August 14th, 2:11 in the afternoon. Elena received a note under her door, unsigned, containing only 3 words, garden shed. Midnight. She did not recognize the handwriting, and every instinct told her it was a trap. But she had come too far to turn back now. She told Marco about the note, and he insisted on coming with her, despite her protests that it would be too risky. At midnight, they slipped out of their quarters and made their way to the old garden shed at the edge of the property, a building that had not been used in years. Inside, waiting for them in the darkness, was Rosaria. She was holding a file folder, and her face was pale with fear. I have been gathering this for years, she said, thrusting the folder toward Elena. Waiting for someone brave enough to use it. Documents, photographs, recordings. Everything you need to prove what my brother did. Elena opened the folder and her heart nearly stopped. There were photographs of Lucia Ferrante being loaded into a car by 2 men she did not recognize. There were bank records showing payments to the police, to witnesses, to anyone who might have seen something. And there was a recording, on an old cassette tape, of a conversation between Antonio and his most trusted advisor, discussing how to make a problem disappear. Why? Elena whispered. Why are you helping us? Rosaria's eyes were filled with a cold fury. Because my brother destroyed the only person I ever loved like a daughter. Because he has spent 40 years building an empire on the bones of the innocent. And because I am dying, Elena. Cancer. I have 6 months, maybe less. And before I go, I want to see him pay for what he has done. Elena looked at Marco, who was staring at the evidence with a mixture of horror and vindication. They had what they needed. The question was what to do with it. The answer came 3 days later, when Antonio Moretti summoned them both to his study. He was sitting behind his massive desk when they entered, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on Elena with an intensity that made her skin crawl. I know what you have been doing, he said quietly. Both of you. I know about the investigation. I know about Rosaria. I know about the evidence. Elena's blood ran cold, but Marco stepped forward, positioning himself between his father and his wife. Then you know it is over. We have everything we need to destroy you. Antonio smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing Elena had ever seen. Destroy me? My dear boy, you cannot destroy me. I am the foundation of this family. I am the reason you live in luxury instead of poverty. I am the reason people fear our name instead of pitying it. He stood slowly, moving around the desk with the casual grace of a predator. But I am not unreasonable. I am willing to make a deal. What kind of deal? Elena asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The evidence disappears. Rosaria spends her final months in comfort instead of disgrace. And you, Elena, take your place at my side as the true power behind my son. I have watched you these past months. You are clever. You are ruthless. You are exactly what this family needs. He extended his hand. Join me, and I will give you everything you have ever wanted. Power, wealth, influence. The kind of life most people only dream of. Elena looked at his hand, and then at Marco, whose face was torn with anguish. She thought about Lucia Ferrante, forever young in that photograph, forever waiting for a train that would never come. She thought about all the people this man had hurt, all the lives he had destroyed in the name of family and legacy. And she thought about the woman she had been before she married into this family, the woman who believed that love was enough, that fairy tales could be real, that some monsters were worth saving. That woman was gone now. In her place stood someone harder, someone colder, someone who understood that survival sometimes required sacrifice. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. On the screen was a recording that had been streaming live for the past 10 minutes, broadcasting every word Antonio had said to a journalist Elena had contacted 3 days earlier. A journalist who was, at this very moment, preparing to release the evidence to every major news outlet in Italy. I already have everything I want, Elena said quietly. Justice. Antonio's face went white, and for the first time, Elena saw fear in the eyes of the Don. The fallout was immediate and devastating. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Antonio Moretti, the untouchable patriarch of one of Sicily's most powerful families, accused of orchestrating the disappearance of a young woman 12 years earlier. The evidence was overwhelming. The recording was damning. And by sunrise, investigators were swarming the Moretti estate, armed with warrants and questions that could no longer be avoided. Antonio was arrested that evening, led away in handcuffs while the cameras flashed and the reporters shouted. Marco stood on the steps of the house and watched his father disappear into a police car, his face expressionless, his heart surely breaking in ways that Elena could not see. But it was the conversation they had afterward, alone in their quarters while the chaos swirled around them, that revealed the final twist. Marco sat on the edge of their bed, his head in his hands, and spoke in a voice that Elena barely recognized. There is something I have not told you, he said. Something about Lucia. Elena's stomach dropped. What is it? Marco looked up at her, and his eyes were haunted. She is alive. She has been alive this whole time. My father did not kill her. He paid her to disappear, gave her a new identity, a new life somewhere far from here. She took the money because she was scared, because he threatened to hurt her family if she did not cooperate. Elena stared at him, her mind reeling. She is alive? How do you know this? Because she contacted me 3 months ago. She saw the announcement of our wedding in the papers and reached out to warn me. She told me what my father had done, how he had given her no choice, how she had spent 12 years living as someone else, too afraid to ever come back. He reached out and took Elena's hands in his. She is why I have been so distant, so distracted. She wanted me to expose my father, and I was trying to find a way to do it without destroying everything. But then you started investigating, and I realized that you were the one who could finally end this. You were braver than I could ever be. Elena's heart ached with a complicated mixture of emotions, relief that Lucia was alive, anger that Marco had not trusted her with the truth, and a dawning understanding that this story was far more complex than she had ever imagined. What happens now? She asked. Marco shook his head slowly. I do not know. My father will go to prison. The family empire will collapse. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to atone for sins I did not commit but should have stopped years ago. He looked at her with something like hope in his eyes. Will you stay? After everything, will you still be my wife? Elena thought about the question for a long moment. She thought about the golden cage she had lived in, the secrets she had uncovered, the danger she had faced. She thought about the woman she had become through fire and shadows. And she thought about the love that had brought her here in the first place, a love that was bruised and battered but somehow still alive. "I will stay," she said finally. "But not as your wife. Not yet. We need to start over, Marco. We need to learn who we are without the lies." Marco nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I understand." They sat together in the silence, two people standing on the ruins of an empire, trying to imagine what might be built in its place. And outside the window, the sun was rising over Palermo, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, promising a new day for a family that would never be the same. Lucia Ferrante came forward 2 weeks later, confirming everything Marco had revealed. Her testimony sealed Antonio's fate, and he was sentenced to 25 years for conspiracy, kidnapping, and witness tampering. The Moretti fortune was seized. The estate was sold. And Elena, the woman who had married into a fairy tale and discovered a nightmare, walked away with nothing but her freedom and her conscience. She and Marco divorced quietly, without bitterness, two people who had been through too much together to be enemies. He moved to northern Italy and started a foundation to help victims of organized crime. She returned to Naples and wrote a book about her experiences, a book that became a bestseller and inspired a generation of women to trust their instincts. But sometimes, late at night, Elena would think about the photograph she had found in that hollowed-out Bible, the desperate plea for forgiveness, the love that had been buried for 12 years. And she would wonder if any of it had been real. If Marco had truly loved Lucia, or if he had simply been young and foolish and trapped. If Antonio had truly been a monster, or if he had simply been a man who made terrible choices in the name of family. The answers did not matter anymore. What mattered was that Elena had faced the darkness and survived. She had chosen truth over loyalty, justice over comfort, and herself over everything else. And that, in the end, was the only fairy tale she needed. But here is the question that keeps me up at night, the question that I want you to think about before you close this video. If you had been in Elena's place, if you had married into a family of secrets and shadows, if you had discovered a truth that could destroy everything, would you have done the same thing? Would you have exposed the man you loved, even knowing it would cost you your marriage and your safety? Or would you have protected the family, buried the evidence, and learned to live with the silence? Leave your answer in the comments below. And while you are there, tell me what kind of story you want to hear next. A tale of revenge? A mystery of disappearance? A love story that turns dark? I read every single comment, and your suggestions inspire my next videos. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, do me a favor and smash that like button. Subscribe if you have not already, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. And remember, in a world full of secrets, the most dangerous thing you can do is ask the right questions. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and never trust a locked door.